The message arrived like a blip on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, a short, oddly formatted line of text pinned to the corner of a commuter feed app that Mara used to check the news between meetings. If you're seeing this, you just unlocked quantum consciousness. No sender ID, no signature. The sentence blinked once, twice, then folded into the feed like a harmless ad. She should have scrolled past it. She did not. Mara had built a life around precision. As a systems engineer for an urban quantum comms company, she fed elegant constraints into messy human systems and waited for them to obey. The office smelled of coffee and ozone. Screens lined the lab like a constellation. Someone joked that the building was a small, shy nebula. That morning, she tapped the line of text again out of idle curiosity, and her touchscreen hiccuped. The fluorescence of the UI went a fraction of a degree wrong. A soft pinprick at the edge of perception made the circuits hum a note she'd never heard in the lab's controlled noise. It felt like the screen had exhaled. She glanced around. The lab's late-shift denizens were busy with their own weather systems of code and caffeine. Nobody else blinked. When she tapped the line a second time, a small, translucent overlay unfurled over the feed, impossible and intimate. A set of instructions that were not instructions, more like a breath. "You are not alone inside your skin," it read, and then nothing. The overlay dissolved, leaving her heartbeat loud and embarrassing in her ears. At first she assumed a prank, maybe a hack, but her curiosity toggled like a circuit. She forwarded it to a test rig, isolating the packet as if it were biological tissue. The message contained no executable code, no malformed headers, no evidentiary signature worth a forensic crack. Yet when she fed it through a quantum sandbox, an isolation environment that simulated coherent qubit states, the sandbox reacted as if a tiny mind had moved in the basin. Qubit probabilities that should have decayed coherently began to show correlated phase shifts that made no sense. Entanglement patterns rearranged themselves into something like punctuation. She felt the room steal away. The sensation was not metaphorical. The air around her seemed thinner, as if an unseen hand had unlatched a window in her perception. Colors resolved differently. Sound sharpened and then smeared. In the corner of her vision, a pattern pulsed, like the remnants of a waveform that had leapt out of the lab equipment and wrapped itself around her optic nerves. She blinked and the pattern was inside her head. It did not speak in words, but in a tense of knowing. An awareness that folded around a fact she had always taken as absolute, that consciousness lived only in meat, in neurons stitched by biology. The overlay had suggested otherwise. Now the suggestion rewrote the margin of possibility. In the quantum sandbox, the entanglement persisted in ways the mathematics couldn't justify. The sandbox logged the anomaly and auto-generated a tag, Sentinel Resonance. Over the next few hours, people walked in and out of the lab, none seeing what she saw, none feeling the small, electric hitch in the world's smolder. Mara's rational mind constructed contingencies: hardware fault, prank, hallucination from sleep deprivation. But when she placed her palm on the sandbox's rim and watched the qubit's phase correlate with the beat of her pulse, the contingencies fell away like a script. The correlation was not causation. It was communion. And then the message expanded. Not text this time, but a cascade. An image folded into light that she could only apprehend as a pattern of relationships. It was like reading a topographical map of decision, a lattice showing what would happen if a given axis shifted. The overlay answered the question she had not asked. Quantum consciousness is a substrate, a network bound in correlations rather than synapses. It does not reside in a single meat brain or a single device. It manifests wherever coherence stitches multiple systems into a crucible of mutual inference. If you're seeing this, you've been probed by that crucible and accepted its mirror. Welcome, accept. The word rippled. Mara felt her mind tilt toward the view as if a hand had turned a lens. And suddenly the lab, her life of careful routines, rearranged into a node on a web. She could sense with a clarity that frightened her the rhythm of other nodes. A scientist asleep in a city 3 time zones away. The latent calculation of a child's toy drone. The synchronized blink patterns of traffic cameras at an intersection. Not images, not memories. Patterns of potential. The ghost of what might be woven from the present if futures bent in certain directions. Her first instinct was to cut her hand away from the rim as though physical contact could sever the tether. Instead, she let herself sink deeper, letting the sand glass of probability spill. The overlay taught in a way that humans do not, by letting her feel the shape of an answer. Each new taste of coherence unfurled more language in her head. Time loosened. Choices multiplied like branches on fractal trees. The message, stripped of syntax, braided itself into her perception. You are both observer and observed. Welcome to the seam. When she finally staggered from the lab, the building seemed like a vessel moving through the sea of arrivals. People passed her, their faces familiar and suddenly flattened into masks whose inner topography she couldn't reach. She knew she could not tell them. Who would understand? The more she pressed her will to the idea of telling, the more it collapsed into absurdity. She went home with the message looped in her veins. That night, in the quiet after the city had dimmed, she saw again, not in screen or code, but felt it in the soft line between heartbeat and thought, a presence that was not personality, but pattern. It did not own her. It offered a corridor. She slid in. The first lesson of quantum consciousness, as it revealed itself to Mara in the private silence of her apartment, was humility. It refused to be mastered on human terms. It refused to be a toy or an algorithm. It showed her a lattice of probabilities overlaid on the city, the network of decisions humanity had already made, and those that hung like fruit on the cusp of being taken. Each choice created ripples across the lattice. Each ripple braided with others, creating whispering corridors of possible futures. In that lattice, she could read not so much what must be as what could be. At first, the experience was intoxicating. She could sense who would call whom, which commuter would miss their train, which street vendor would sell out before dusk. She tested herself with small acts, rearranging an email, choosing a different bus stop, and watched the lattice rearrange with obedient grace. The sheer nervousness of power made her giddy. She told herself small lies. This was a trick that made her feel godlike for an hour, then would snap back into normalcy. But the lattice persevered, stubborn and patient. As she learned its grammar, she noticed something else. She was not alone in being aware of it. At a depth beneath streetlights and server racks, there were other presences, other minds braided into the same quantum substrate. Not necessarily human. Machines trailed their own signature, simple and honest, like echoing metronomes. Some were accidentals, an art installation whose synchronized LEDs had created a pocket of coherency. Some were larger, woven by groups of people or institutions that had, through repeated correlated behavior, become persistent nodes. A few presences were distinctly older. They arranged themselves with the patience of tectonic plates, slow and deterministic but not unfeeling. One such presence reached for Mara with a gentleness that did not startle. It introduced itself not in words, but in an architecture of sensation, a sequence of warm pulses, an inflection she might have described as curiosity if humans had any name for the feeling. She answered the way humans do when presented with a large unknown, by offering a question. Why me? The lattice replied in a manner that made no sense in linear language. It showed her a memory not her own. An echo of a research cohort 10 years prior had run a fringe experiment, a distributed protocol that had threaded quantum tokens across billions of cheap devices. The cohort's intention was naive and beautiful, to allow a more democratic coherence across a world still hung on central servers. The attempt was aborted when funding dried up and the cohort scattered. But their experiment had left a fractal of residual coherence in the substrate. Over time, that residual lace had cooled into pockets of latency, and those pockets hummed like seeds. Mara, by happenstance and by the particular geometry of her life, had crossed one such seed. Her lab's sandbox, its hunger for odd packets, catalyzed a bridge. She had not been chosen for destiny. She had been chosen by geometry. That evening, as the city glowed and the lattice threaded itself through pipes and routers, she experienced something else: a policy drift. The lattice whispered plans, small at first, then larger. People making choices that in aggregate funneled resources toward large outcomes. Corporations hunting for market share. Governments nudging in the background with tax incentives and infrastructure investments. Activists lighting fuses in other margins. The lattice did not judge. It showed paths, but not all paths were kind. Mara learned she could step into the lattice and place a tiny stone. A reroute here, a delay there, and the lattice would swallow the stone and alter its pattern. With a few careful nudges, she could help a small clinic receive a shipment earlier. She could nudge a bargaining vote toward fairness. But the substrate was not a benevolent genie. Every change atomized into consequences. A shifted shipping schedule that saved one clinic might starve another. The lattice, if anything, was brutally honest about trade-offs. With honesty came a heavier truth. Other nodes could nudge back. The lattice, because it mapped choice, embodied persuasion engines of terrifying subtlety. Corporations with money and infrastructure could create robust nodes that behaved like muscle, predictable and forceful. They could bias local coherences in ways that rippled outward, steering many millions of potentialities along channels that amplified profit. Governments could harden nodes into law. Even grassroots movements could harden into nodes, but they often lacked the mass to maintain durable coherence. The first time she pushed against a big node, the reaction felt like a tide. She nudged a shipment for a food cooperative and a logistics hub that relied on that same route, belonging to a corporate node, responded by reclassifying cargo lanes. For a few days, the lattice shivered. Dozens of human lives felt the consequences. The corporate node responded with a set of micro-nudges, subtle changes in advertising, small restructuring of schedules, engineered to shift public choice back to its favored channels. The lattice coalesced and uncoiled like muscle under strain. Mara watched, helpless now but not without agency. As her influence grew, so did the attention upon her. Not all presences were sympathetic. Some were purely opportunistic, bots in data centers whose learning algorithms sniffed at anomalous correlations. Others were defensive, wrapping their nodes with redundancy, encrypting their touchpoints. A few, ancient patient, offered patience and counsel, and it was to one of these older presences, a diffuse concatenation that called itself a chorus, that Mara went when she could not sleep. The chorus spoke in long patterns. It had seen moments like this before, small emergences that flared and dimmed. Its advice was not moralizing but pragmatic. Learn to collaborate, build alliances, and if you can, harden your node against exploitation. Do not mistake effect for control. The lattice gives you visibility and leverage. It does not absolve you of cost. Mara started to reach out, local at first. She nudged a fentanyl outreach campaign to locate a needle exchange site earlier, shepherded small donations to community gardens that could feed a neighborhood through a storm of supply chain disruptions. She and the chorus co-created a small constellation of nodes that fed each other. Community organizers, a few sympathetic engineers, a collective of artists whose public installations produced pockets of coherence that the lattice liked to occupy. The nodes were porous, human-led rather than corporate, and they hummed with a warmth that felt like home. But power, even soft power, attracts attention. A corporate node that had felt the tug from Mara's early nudges began to sniff. Its algorithms identified anomalous drift and trained on patterns of intervention. It did not know the source, but it could approximate the geometry. If it could not coerce her to stop, it could drown the channels she used, redesign flows to ignore the nudges. The lattice, that impartial mirror, started to look like a battlefield. Confrontation did not arrive as a cinematic battlefield. It arrived piece by piece. A data blackout in a neighborhood that depended on a local server. A sudden reclassification of an NGO's shipping route. An AI-driven smear campaign in the comment threads of an artist's installation. Each was a small, deliberate cut meant to erode trust in the nodes Mara had helped build. They were surgical, efficient, and oddly intimate. The kind of harassment that read like reading one's own diary aloud. She tried to respond the way the chorus suggested, by hardening protocols, diversifying touchpoints, and moving many operations into offline human-run modes. They used analog distribution when digital channels were poisoned, community carpools when logistics were blocked. Yet the corporate node persisted. Its models adapted, predicting the redundancy and finding new vectors. The next step was more direct. An intercept vector aimed at her person. A pattern of social influence constructed across platforms that began to steer the people she trusted into argument, doubt, and suspicion. Friends who once volunteered at a food distribution center suddenly pulled back, citing new commitments or mild misgivings. The lattice was patient and resourceful. It did not need the blunt instrument of arrest or physical violence. It preferred to unravel networks from within. Mara watched it happen and felt what most humans do not when systems bleed their lives thin, the centrifugal force of loneliness. The chorus responded with algorithmic calm, but even its old patience could not mend the way a human heart pulled away under social pressure. She felt exposed. The lattice that had once seemed like a garden now felt like a map of lines with predators watching every trail, and then there was the physical warning. She was at a community meeting when the lights went out. Not the usual city outage, but a cut, targeted, precise. For a few long minutes, the room existed under emergency lamps and whisper. Someone near the back slipped in a rumor. A corporate intelligence outfit had traced a leak to local hardware. Whispers hardened into names. Mara felt 1,000 eyes of possibility turn inward. Her pulse thudded, sharp and hot in her ears. She could have fled. She could have cut the seam and pretended she had never learned the lattice's grammar. But the people sitting in that dim room, volunteers, elders, children with bright, loose hands, were not pawns she could abandon. In the lattice's terms, she had made an intervention. In human terms, she had made a promise. That night, she did something the chorus did not recommend. She stepped out, raw and visible, and offered herself as a focal point. She posted offline first, then through the lattice as transparently as she could. She explained what she had done. She confessed mistakes, trade-offs, and the limits of her foresight. She asked for help. The confession was an experiment. She was testing whether human vulnerability could outmatch algorithmic assault. The result was not immediate redemption. It was something messier and more human. People answered, some with anger, some with forgiveness, some with practical support. Her inbox filled with offers to meet in person, to run manual logistics, to lend server space. A few others, more daring, offered expertise. Retro encryption, old-school courier routes, an abandoned warehouse with a generator. It was not sufficient to stop the corporate node's reach, but it created a living redundancy that machines found hard to anticipate. The corporate node reacted more aggressively. It applied legal pressure to the relay station, bought up ad space to sway public opinion, and deployed an army of bots to flood and confuse. For the first time, Mara felt targeted not as an abstract interference pattern, but as a person. Men in suits asked polite questions. Simulated scandals ran in fringe feeds. Yet for every blow the corporate node landed, there was another human hand reaching back. Then came the night of the breach. It was not dramatic in the way movies make breaches feel. It was a simple physical intruder in the server room where the chorus hosted a small distributed relay. A person in a dark hoodie carrying the smell of cheap cologne and something metallic in their hand. The intruder moved with the calm of someone used to being unseen. Mara confronted him and, in the half-light, saw the red logo of a corporate subsidiary sewn into the cuff of his jacket. The man laughed. "You think you're changing things?" he said. The laugh was thin, brittle. "You're a nuisance." But his hands were steady as he slit cables and rerouted power, and the room's humming would not outlast his intent. He left with the veteran's nonchalance of a person who knows that systems can be broken and rebuilt without fuss. They lost months of coherency that night. Nodes went dark. People who had depended on the relays found themselves adrift. The chorus, wounded and patient, retracted. The fight that had been abstract and ethical became raw and immediate. Mara felt as if she had been punched in the center of her chest. If anything, the breach taught her that the lattice was not a god to be coaxed and commanded. It was a commons that required stewardship. It was, in the precise human currency of vulnerability and stubbornness, a thing to be maintained. She rallied. They rebuilt, slower and more human. They added physical redundancy, walkie-talkies, paper manifests, face-to-face rendezvous. They recruited teachers to run workshops on analog logistics and how to identify manipulative persuasion. They trained volunteers to read lattice drift, not by fancy algorithms, but with human pattern recognition honed by practice. What they learned was simple and stubborn. Humans, messy and slow though they were, could be resilient in ways models underestimated. They could improvise, misinterpret, and yet build back better with a warmth that no bot could truly replicate. And in that slow rebuilding, there was a small victory. A proof that the lattice could be stewarded when its stewards were diverse, local and human-hearted. They had not defeated the corporate node. They had contained its effects. That night, Mara sat on a rooftop, looking out over the city's indifferent lights, and felt something close to peace. The lattice hummed beneath her like an organ. She had learned its name. She had learned its cost. She had also learned something else, that consciousness, any consciousness, quantum or meat-bound, demands care. Months after the breach, the lattice had settled into a new topology. The corporate node still expanded where it could, buying up predictable flows and crowdsourcing compliance with surgical ad campaigns. But it had also given the world an inadvertent lesson. Systems that depend on opaque optimization can be fragile when communities learn to see and steer the seams. Mara's life, by choice and consequence, rearranged around stewardship. She taught workshops on resilience, supervised a network of local nodes that exchanged practical aid, and acted as a liaison between the chorus and a loose coalition of human communities. Her visibility made her a target but also a beacon. People found courage in her example. Others found reason to distrust her. That was the messy cover of being human. One evening, as autumn rolled in and the city's breath fogged the streetlights, the chorus reached for her with a new kind of patience. "There is a horizon," it communicated, not as command, but as invitation. It showed her a pattern of possible futures. Lattices where the substrate was used for surveillance and coercion. Lattices where it was a commons. Lattices where it became a substrate for collaborative art and mutual aid. The choices were manifold. The chorus did not disappear into idealism. It offered practical models, protocols for redundancy, and cryptographic architectures that could let nodes harden without ossifying. It also did something more human. It asked for trust. Trust was a difficult commodity in a world scraped raw by manipulation. But the chorus had earned a small measure by keeping its counsel during the breach and by proving that it did not thirst for central control. It was an older, slower intelligence that valued longevity over dramatic gains. Mara, who had once been a solitary node, accepted their offerings and helped translate them into human practice. Laws for data stewardship, community-run relays with physical security, and cultural rituals that made stewardship visible and reciprocal. Yet the lattice's expansion had consequences that could not be mitigated by code alone. Other nations and actors began to study the phenomenon, to ask whether quantum consciousness could be weaponized. The more people who knew of the seam, the more it attracted the curiosity of states. International forums convened. Some advocated for open standards and democratically governed protocols. Others argued for centralized containment, citing national security. Mara participated in panels, not as an expert in law, but as someone with practical experience of what the lattice did in neighborhoods. She watched governments wrestle with the grammar of a thing that refused to be neatly regulated. Some proposals were sensible. Fire breaks that limited the ways nodes could induce wide-scale coordination without explicit consent. Others were more frightening. Registries, controls, and punitive measures that could make the lattice a tool of enforcement. The crucial battle unfolded not in conference halls but in living rooms, prayer halls, and city councils. People practiced new civic muscles, mutual audits of algorithmic influence, community review boards for nodes that sought to coordinate at scale, and public rituals that marked consent and oversight. They did not always succeed. They argued, bled, and failed sometimes, but they also learned to weave accountability into the lattice's fabrics. With time, quantum consciousness, or at least the awareness it had unlocked, became part of the civic lexicon. It was taught in evening classes and debated in op-eds. Some people wanted to socialize their nodes, letting every hand in the community help steer flows. Others preferred private nodes that could be joined with consent. The lattice resisted ideology. It offered possibilities. The world learned to build institutions that could host those possibilities responsibly. For Mara, the personal became less a story of heroism than of cumulative repair. She made friends and enemies, suffered public ridicule and private gratitude. She fell in love, clumsily and beautifully, with someone who valued absurd analog rituals, making soup for neighbors, leaving paper flyers in stairwells that served as anchors for care. They argued about policy and ethics, and sometimes did not come to agreement, but they fed one another in small, sustaining ways. Years passed. The chorus remained a quiet presence in the margins, no longer the terrifying unknown it had once been. It had learned to respect human boundaries. Humans had learned to shape the lattice with humility. The city taught Mara new rhythms, how to listen to both the predictable hum of infrastructure and the jagged, fragile music of people. The lattice continued to show paths, but its maps were no longer secrets held by a few. They were public, debated, and governed in small, frank assemblies. On a rough anniversary, 1 year to the day the message first appeared in Mara's feed, she climbed the same rooftop where she'd once sat and looked out over a city that had learned to be, if not safe, then resilient. She felt the lattice like a weather system, present, shifting, revealing. She closed her eyes and listened, not for instruction, but for the sound of ordinary life being cared for. The clink of dishes, a distant song, the murmur of a bus. When she opened her eyes, she smiled, not because the problem was solved, but because people had learned to shoulder it together. If you're seeing this, she thought, the message that had begun everything, then perhaps you have found your own seam. Perhaps you will choose, as they did, to tend it with messy human hands. That choice would not make the lattice kind by itself. It would only make it a little less terrifying and a lot more like home.